Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Peter Ho to you, and it's actually with great respect and with gratitude that I do so. Anyway, it's with great pleasure and respect that I do so, because Peter had agreed to be chairman of this session, in which Ambassador Lam Chong-yong was going to talk about complexity and Tao. But last week, Ambassador Lam was called upon by the Singaporean government for some urgent business somewhere else in the world. And much to his regret and to mine, he had to cancel his talk for this conference. And to find at such a short notice somebody or a speaker, another speaker, with equal stature and eminence as Ambassador Lam, and with a relevant story to tell, initially seemed totally impossible to me. But then one person came to mind. I knew he had the time slot available. That was Peter Ho. And if you read his curriculum and in the conference book, you understand why Peter, why I thought of Peter. Peter's stature and eminence is very hard to match, actually. And what is more, he has a complexity story to tell. As I understand it, Peter introduced the concept of complexity to the thinking of the Singaporean government already in the 1990s. In 2004, while still in the Ministry of Defense, he launched the Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning program as part of the National Security Coordination Program, or Secretariat. And one goal of the RAHS, as it's called, is to explore emerging issues with the aim of enhancing strategic anticipation capabilities for the different government agencies in Singapore. Now, RAHS has become, since, the envy and example for many countries in the world. Peter is retired, but if you look at his present activities as listed in his curriculum, you wonder what he did when he worked. And that list is not complete at all. He is also chairman, it's not mentioned in his curriculum in the booklet, of the advisory board of CELSI, which is one of the centers of excellence in NTU. And I remember Yehuda Cohen, who is not here now, but who was one of the speakers last year, but is one of the directors of CELSI, telling me about the first dinner with Peter, saying that he was totally amazed at the breadth of vision and depth and of insight that made Peter see parallels between communities of microbes and society. And based on that, ask probing questions as to the emerging properties of both. So the key word, of course, to describe these emerging properties is complexity. And Peter, as you may have seen in the conference booklet, is also a member of the advisory board of the Complexity Program. And he is delightfully straightforward. When I asked him last week, after he agreed to speak, if he could write a summary of his talk for the booklet, he responded, "Not possible. Too short notice." Yep. So it was very warm feelings and great pleasure that I ask you to welcome Peter Ho.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'm an old age pensioner. So perhaps because I have a lot more time on my hands, and that's why Jan really chose me to speak, because if you go and look for somebody else, they've all got an excuse. Lam Chong-yong is an ambassador at large. I'm only an advisor. An advisor is somebody whom you can either ignore, or if you wish to, from time to time, throw him a few crumbs and say, well, okay, what you said makes a lot of sense. But that's about what an advisor adds up to. And I must say, one reason why I didn't want to write a synopsis is because as of yesterday night, I had 150 slides in my slide deck, and I only whittled it down to 120, and I decided, well, let's try to see how much progress we'll be able to make with that. Okay, first, let's start with black swans. We all know now what black swans are. Nassim Taleb made black swans very famous, and I think in Singapore, everybody knows about black swans now. And Black swans result from complexity. But there's also a whole family of other swans. You know, you've got the white swan, of course. Then you've got the dirty white swan. You know? This is an improbable event, but actually it's not improbable, but everybody ignores it, then it becomes a dirty white swan. You have a red swan, Gordon Wu. They even got a black turkey. A gray swan, highly probable event, predictable, impact can easily cascade, and these are things like weather, population events. Then you got the black swan. And I was introduced to something else because of something which ICRM did just a week ago, Dragon Kings. Supposedly predictable events in complex systems which can often spin out of control, leading to extreme events. This is a term coined by Didier Sonnet and some of his colleagues. So that's Dragon King. And then Rumsfeld. There are known knowns. These are things we know. We also know that there are unknown unknowns. That is to say, we know that there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know. Donald Rumsfeld. So we got black swans, we got dragon kings, we got unknown unknowns. Now, as far as I know, black swans are real. They exist at least in Perth. Dragon kings are the stuff of myth and legend. Unknown unknowns are, of course, unknown. Does it really matter? Asian financial crisis, 1997, 1998. That was maybe a black swan, and it was real. The effects, and we still see some of the effects today. Terrorism, 2001, US experienced 9/11. In Singapore, we experienced, or almost experienced, our own version of 9/11 on 7th December 2001, which was the uncovering of the infamous Jamia Islamiyah terrorist network, which had a grand plan to take over the whole of Southeast Asia. So that was a real shock to the system, for Singapore, which seen itself as a very peaceful, safe, and secure country. 2003, Singapore, SARS. That was also a big shock. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew whether we would survive. For some unfortunate reason, we had something called super spreaders in Singapore. People who were particularly virulent, they became nodes of infection, and they just spread the infection throughout Singapore. Dozens of people died in this thing. Singapore was one of the most badly hit of the countries affected by SARS. So this was a big shock to the system. Financial crisis 2008, 2009, we still feel the reverberations of that. Thai floods, 2001. Now, you may ask, was the Thai floods of 2001 a big shock? In a way it wasn't, but in a way it was. It was a big shock. It wasn't a big shock because in Thailand it's quite a low-lying country. It floods all the time. But this time round, the floods were so widespread, they started to flood industrial estates. They caused disruption to global supply chains. So it was a big shock. Hurricane Sandy. Those of you who are in the US know this was a big shock. It was as bad or even worse than Katrina. Eurozone crisis. I don't think it's over, but I'm not an economist, I'm not a financial expert, but my bet is it's still going to rumble on and create a lot of problems. And then the Arab Spring. I put spring in red and in inverted commas because I never believed it was a spring. I thought it was a winter, and I think it is. It is something like a winter. And what happened? Surprised everybody. Government collapsed in 4 countries. There were government changes in Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and now there's a civil war in Syria. No end in sight. Now, this is a quote I found, which is a gentleman called H.L. Fisher, Harold Fisher. He was politician and historian. I think he probably prefers to think, well, now he's passed away, but he probably prefers to think of himself as a historian. And he said, men wiser and more learned than I have discerned in history a plot, a rhythm, a predetermined pattern. But these harmonies are concealed from me. He's being very honest. You know? The philosopher Kierkegaard, life is understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. Now that's very profound. And this introduces a concept of retrospective coherence. The current state of affairs always makes logical sense, but only when we look backwards, hindsight. The current pattern is logical, but it is only one of many patterns that could have been formed, any one of which would have been equally logical. And why does retrospective coherence arise? It arises because of complexity, I think. Black swans will surprise us time and again because of complexity. And you know, I must say that I always tell people there's a difference between complex and complicated. A complicated system, a complicated environment, well, it can produce outcomes and results that are repeatable. It performs in a predictable way. It may look very complex to you, but actually it really performs in a repeatable way. So a satellite in orbit, you know, you say it's very complex, but in fact it is just a complicated system because it just keeps on repeating itself. The 787 Dreamliner is, I hope, a complicated system. If it's a complex system, we're in big trouble, you know. It's designed to fly. If you steer it right, it turns right. If you steer it left, it goes to the left. If you bring it down, it nose will point downwards. That's a complicated system. But a complex system, and we heard the presentation just now, human societies are all complex systems. The world is a complex system. There are many things we don't understand. So we are still trying to understand why civilizations rise, civilizations fall. We're trying to understand, does the monsoon really affect the rise and fall of nations and countries? Maybe it does. We can't be sure. And we are still discovering it. And why? Because of complexity. And this is my only genuflection in the direction of Tao. To quote Lao Tzu, everything is connected and everything relates to each other. That's Eastern description of complexity. So what is complexity? You know, these are standard attempts to define it. But the point which I perhaps would like to make is that the collective behaviors of agents within a complex system can deliver discontinuous and nonlinear shocks to the system, which in turn can result in catastrophic failure. Just Paul Omerod, the English economist, in orthodox economic theory, the agents involved in any particular market are presumed to be able to both gather and process substantial amounts of information efficiently in order to form expectations on the likely costs and benefits associated with different courses of action and to respond to incentives and disincentives in an appropriate manner. But this is the important point he's making. The one thing these hypothetical individuals who are agents within a complex system do not do is to allow their behavior to be influenced directly by the behavior of others, and their tastes and preferences are assumed to be fixed, regardless of how others behave. So in a way, he's saying that the traditional economists look at the complex economic system as a complicated system rather than as a complex system. And so this is what happens when you do that. Now, there's another problem with complexity. You know, maybe each event on its own is predictable. So you think about an earthquake. Earthquake maybe is predictable, maybe. And tsunamis are usually not always, but usually connected with earthquakes. But the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, you had one earthquake triggering a massive tsunami, which then flooded the nuclear power station at Fukushima, causing basically a meltdown. Now, when you combine all of these together, the cumulative effects, can you predict that? It's very, very difficult to combine all these complex events and then say, well, you're going to face a catastrophic failure because of that. So this is one of the challenges, complexity. Then we have this other problem, wicked problems. Wicked problems is a term coined by Horst Rittel. These are about highly complex problems, not simple, complicated problems, but complex problems. They have multiple stakeholders. So you take something like climate change. Everybody has a different view on climate change. If you are sitting in government, you may have a view on climate change. If you are a physical scientist, you have another view. You have economists, you have a third view. If you are part of NGO, you have a fourth view. Everybody has a different view. How do you align these perspectives? And then how do you find a solution that will satisfy all the different stakeholders? Very difficult. That's why it's called the wicked problem. Pandemics, sustainable development, aging, wicked problems, climate change, food, water, energy security is a wicked problem. You solve one problem, you may create a problem in another space. So complexity generates black swans, unknown unknowns, wicked problems, all kinds of things. And this is my assertion. The frequency of strategic shocks seems to be increasing, and the amplitude of the impact appears to be growing. And the question is, why? Now, Anthropocene. I think, in fact, in the last complexity conference, there was some presentation on the Anthropocene. This is the period in the Earth's history in which the human impact has become decisive. Before that, it's all geological. Before the Anthropocene, it was the Holocene, which is a geological era. And these are just screenshots which show, the amount of air networks, the urban areas, shipping routes, and so on. It just shows, human beings on the planet, what they do to the planet. This is, look, Dubai. Out of desert, sheer human will, and of course a lot of oil money, you can do that. Is this good? Is it bad? I don't know, but this is Anthropocene. And there are all kinds of effects: climate change, acidification, ozone depletion, phosphorus cycle, fresh water use, biodiversity, and so on. All kinds of things affected. And we also were introduced to this great acceleration in the last conference, and it's remarkable. Only in the last 50 years, there's been a surge in all kinds of activities, ranging from population, GDP growth, FDI, even McDonald's, somewhere down there. The number of McDonald's has shot up since the 1950s, only in the last 50 years. Telephones, motor vehicles. And our colleague Helga said, evolution increases complexity. And Stephen Hawking said, the 21st century will be the century of complexity. So we are living in a complex world. Unfortunately, it's not just complex, it's getting more and more complex. And we better recognize that we are operating in an unordered, complex environment. We are not operating today in an ordered, merely complicated environment. So the challenges of complexity, and as the connections between the problems and solutions become less clear, that is, it's very hard to connect the cause and the effect, we will sooner or later have to face the unintended consequences of our decisions. So in other words, you make a decision in a complex system, it may look as if it's working for a while, but after a while, it's no longer valid. It starts to unravel because of all the hidden connections and agents that are operating in a complex system. So policies and plans can have effects not easily predicted. And policymakers, and that includes all of us, who rely on a linear mechanistic approach can get things quite wrong. So that's everybody. That's a problem. In a complex world, success is not preordained. Success is not a permanent condition. And this applies both to companies, organizations, as well as to governments. You know, I'm a bit of a camera buff, and I used to take film. Now, Kodak is finished. Its name, I think, is preserved, and I think is some licensing deal with JK Imaging, but it's finished. They didn't foresee the advent of digital. They foresaw it, but they didn't realize it was going to be a serious game-changing threat. Borders. You know, I was in San Francisco, actually after attending some conference in the Santa Fe Institute, and we were there for the night, and we said, well, I want to go to a bookshop. He said, there are no more bookshops left. Where are the bookshops? Barnes & Noble shut down, Borders bankrupt. So this is the end of life as we know it. But Borders was slow on the uptake. They didn't see the threat posed by e-books. They were slow to establish an online presence. Nokia, it was first a disruptor, very successful. It established a presence across the entire spectrum, from the mass market telephones to the very sophisticated smart telephones. They understood the importance of selling lifestyle. Then they got disrupted by Apple and by Samsung. And they had no answer to Android, they had no answer to iPhones. Now, I don't know whether they'll be saved by Windows 8 and Lumia, and I don't know whether they are innovator anymore, or are they just following the trend? Reader's Digest, another icon bites the dust. Apple. Is Apple next? We don't know. But we have to ask ourselves, will Apple go the way of all its illustrious predecessors? Yeah? You know, they lost Steve Jobs. But then, this is where I'm going to introduce you a bit later on to Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma. Dick Foster, who wrote the book Creative Destruction, he said that 75% of Standard & Poor's 500 in 15 years will be companies whose names you do not know. What it means is 75% of the companies today will be wiped out. They will be usurped by new innovators, insurgents who come up with new game-changing ideas. So this is constant cycle. Clayton Christensen, and I paraphrase his book, successful organizations are doomed to fail in the long run because there's tremendous inertia to change a formula that has worked well. This inertia allows the insurgents, the revolutionaries, the startups to sneak in, change the rules of the game, capture market share, and dislodge the incumbent. I asked him about what he thinks about governments. He said he never studied governments, but he said he thinks it applies as much to governments as it does to companies. So organizations must change and adapt or they die. Companies can fold, they can file for Chapter 11, but what happens to governments? If they fail, this is what happens. Now, Singapore, success story. Today, the world's second most competitive economy, this is what the WEF says. World's busiest port, world's best airport, number 2 home ownership, number 3 in GDP per capita, PPP, number 5 life expectancy. This is a remarkable achievement by any standards, all achieved within the space of about 40, 50 years. But this is the Clayton Christensen moment. Are we the apple of nations, or are we just what we are, a little red dot? This is, you remember that, huh? Maybe we should swap them around, huh? But anyway, the two Peters. Now, the obstacles. our inability to make sense of complexity. And I want to introduce you to a special type of failure that all human beings are prone to, and this is accentuated by complexity: cognitive failure. One example is hyperbolic discounting. You place less emphasis on what's going to happen in future and give more weight to what happens today. And this is a serious problem because governments will tend to invest more in dealing with the fire in front of you, which may be quite cheap to put out, but it's burning, so you put it out, rather than investing long-term, which will perhaps cost money, but why should I pay an insurance premium? Hyperbolic discounting. And those of you who are interested, just Google cognitive biases. You'll have about 100 or so cognitive biases. This is the problem. Human beings have so many cognitive biases. This is just an example of some of them. Daniel Kahneman's area of expertise. Bounded rationality. Limited information and time pressure mean that the decision maker cannot possibly make a rational choice. You're bombarded with so much information, so many demands on your time. How do you make a decision? So you make a decision, but it is, at best, a suboptimal decision. It's not an optimal decision. So human cognitive limitations constrains the ability to deal with complexity and to anticipate black swans and other strategic surprises. This is the problem. You know, we say, okay, we talk about black swans, we talk about complexity, but are we equipped to deal with it? And I think that is a big challenge. So we can talk a lot about the theory, we can write reams of books and make a lot of presentations, but can we get the decision makers to make the right decisions in the face of all the incontrovertible evidence of climate change and things like that? Big problem. Just give you one example. You know, we talked about modeling world systems. I just want to talk to you about the dangers of modeling world systems. This is the famous Club of Rome report, which came out, I think, in 1970 or so, 72. And the report was called Limits to Growth, and it was an attempt to model the global economy and world population. Singapore fell for it hook, line, and sinker. We were persuaded that that model predicted a Malthusian disaster if we did nothing to control the population. So we introduced a very effective policy called Stop at 2. Yeah? So we didn't just stop at 2, we finally the brakes finally kicked in when we were at 1.2. So we are now 1.2. Our TFR today is 1.2. It's way below the replacement level of 2.1. So in other words, in population terms, we became a developed country long before we were really a developed country. And everything the government did after they realized it was a mistake failed to lift the TFR. And what happened? It's very difficult to model the world. It's a complex system. And what was the big failure of the Club of Rome report? The big failure of the Club of Rome report, it didn't anticipate the fact that technology could improve agriculture. You got all these new hybrids, you know, the miracle rice and all that sort of thing, which allowed you to produce enough food to feed the world. Of course, we are entering another cycle where people are asking, well, maybe we might not be able to feed the world because of climate change and all that, but, you know, I'm just giving you the example of dangers of modeling. So this has led, this is only for Singaporeans, problems with the Singapore population white paper. Yeah. And there are winners because there's uncertainty. Without uncertainty, there can be no winners. Instead of seeing uncertainty as a problem, we should start viewing it as a basic source of our future success. So the question is, how can we make better decisions in a complex operating environment? Those governments that can learn to manage complexity will gain a strategic competitive advantage. And I was reading this book, Ghosts of Empire by Kwasi Kwarteng. He's British. He's a British member of parliament, but born in Nigeria. So I guess he's looking at things a fairly objective way. The British Empire was a complex system. It established a presence in 6 out of 7 continents, except I think the Antarctica. And that's as complex a system as you can imagine. How did they run it so successfully for so many years? They ran it because they learned, maybe not consciously, but they knew they left it. They learned how to deal with complexity by not controlling it too much. All they did was a handful of colonial administrators, plus a strong navy and perhaps a few soldiers here and there. So long as they shared the same convictions, the civilizing influence of the white man, belief in their strong destiny, that helped them. And they corrected things along the way. This was Britain running a complex system. So anticipating change is a profound and critical strategic capability. Now, we think a lot here about foresight methodologies. It's important. You know, we have said how difficult it is to predict the future. There are going to be black swans. But we still have to think about the future. What's the future going to bring? So we try to bring in foresight methodologies to improve the way we think about the future. And we want to think about the future in new ways. It cannot be a linear way of looking at the future. And we also need to use these foresight methodologies to overcome our latent assumptions and biases. The goal is to shape the future and not to predict what it will be. Now, scenario planning is one of our basic methodologies in Singapore. And Shell was one of the pioneers. This is one of the key pioneers in that effort, Peter Schwartz, I mean. And last year it commemorated 40 years of scenario planning. And scenario planning helped Shell avoid the oil shock in the 70s. Now, for 2 decades, the Singapore government has been crafting national scenarios. And it's a key part of the Singapore government's strategic planning process. It's embedded into our annual strategic planning and budget cycles. And you know, we have produced both national scenarios as well as what we call focus scenarios. So examples of national scenarios: Hotel Singapore and Home Divided. Actually, in scenario planning, if you've got a good title, people remember them. You don't even have to explain what it means. But these were 2 scenarios, Hotel Singapore and Home Divided, which I would say kind of foresaw the situation we are in today. And these were produced very early on. We did some work also on new media and climate change. Talked about the prosthesis for the imagination. So in Singapore, we use scenario planning partly to surface hidden assumptions and mental models. And this is quoting Peter Wack. We aim to design scenarios that lead our decision makers to question their inner model of reality and change it as necessary in order to take action. But scenario planning doesn't quite fully address everything. It's not very good in a non-linear, complex environment. And it also doesn't work very well in terms of the feedback loops, because once you lock into a scenario, it kind of sticks with you for a while, and very difficult to change every few months just because the environment changes. So we've gone beyond scenario planning. Scenario planning remains our base, but we are doing things like backcasting, policy gaming, which I'll explain a bit. We now have a suite of tools called Scenario Planning Plus, SP Plus, emphasizing that scenario planning is still there, it's still the base, but on top of that, we complement it and supplement it with other methodologies, the Carnarvon framework from Dave Snowden, backcasting, causal layered analysis. This is backcasting. That means you try to imagine the future you want, or your worst case, your worst nightmare, and what could possibly take you from here to there. Then you know what to do, because then you're looking for indicators. Siemens calls this photographs of the future. And we also do work on emerging strategic issues. That means what are the issues that are lurking just over the horizon, which could suddenly pop up and then either create challenges or opportunities for you. And I managed to get a few examples of the kind of emerging strategic issues which we are working on in Singapore. Post-ethnic Singapore. Very interesting. Just this data. Transnational marriages where one partner is non-Singaporean now comprise 41% of new marriages in Singapore, while 20% of new marriages are inter-ethnic. And this figure is rising steadily. So what does this mean for Singapore? It's clearly going to have an impact. We don't understand it, but at least it's flagged as an emerging issue which policymakers should pay attention to. Enhancing our brains, this is just one of these things. Drugs which can improve your cognitive ability. And people will take, apparently, at least I don't know where they get this data from which country, but people will take cognition-enhancing drugs despite mild side effects. That's from Nature. And then 3D printing. Is there a kind of post-manufacturing economy that we have to start worrying about? You know, what happens when you can make things, customize things to order, and when you can do things in small batches rather than on the big Ford-like industrial scale. So these are some of the emerging strategic issues we look at. Policy gaming. How do you overcome your cognitive biases? How do you get your people to feel more comfortable making decisions in conditions of uncertainty? And my inspiration for this was the military, because the military, they know, at least I think the best militaries will know that the moment the first shot is fired, all their plans have to be thrown out of the window because of uncertainty and complexity. So if governments also, why can't they behave like militaries? And so instead of calling it war gaming, we call it policy gaming in Singapore. So we are beginning to introduce it, and it's a safe environment for contemplating issues outside the comfort zone, and it's also good for helping people to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty and complexity. Jan spoke about RAHS, and the inspiration for RAHS, by the way, was John Poindexter, who used to head he was Reagan's national security advisor, Iran-Contra scandal. But he's an excellent engineer, and he conceptualized something before big data became fashionable, the ability to trawl through mountains of databases to look for anomalous behavior. And we decided it's possible. He persuaded me that it was technically possible. The only difference is in Singapore, we have a man in the loop. We don't leave it entirely to the machine to make the decisions. We have a man in the loop. Now, in complex environments, experimentation is more valuable than prediction of analytical models. Now, this is the famous eruption of this Icelandic volcano with a name which I cannot pronounce. Professor, you can pronounce that? How do you pronounce it? Eyjafjallajökull. Jökull. Okay, this is a tongue twister for me. But why was it? Why do we look at Jökull? Oh, I see. Okay, good. All right. Well, I guess in Iceland you shouldn't be surprised to find icicles, a lot of icicles there. A glacier, okay. But why was this a surprise? volcanoes erupt all the time. It was a surprise because it threw up a huge dust cloud, which then spread over Europe and forced the aviation authorities to ground all the aircraft. It disrupted air travel. It, I think, caused panic among all the airlines operating in Europe, and I think began to start to affect global supply chains. But we were surprised. Then what happened? Lufthansa, feeling the pressure, said, well, this cannot go on forever, We can't wait for the dust cloud to clear. So they said, let's do a test flight. And so I guess by that time the political pressure was so much they decided, since Lufthansa has volunteered, let them go and fly it. If something happens, there's only one aircraft and a couple of pilots. That's all. And it flew and no problems. So after that, they lifted the ban. Now remember, they based the Europeans based it on 2 data points. The 2 data points, one data point involved British Airways, the second data point involved Singapore Airlines. This was, I think, 2 decades before. There was a big volcanic eruption in one of the volcanoes in Java, Indonesia. And the British Airways flew through that cloud, and it almost crashed. And it was just sheer pilot skill that brought the aircraft down safely, because the ash pitted all the turbine blades and I think made the windscreen basically invisible. So that, and then some months later, I think Singapore Airlines also flew through this thing. It wasn't so bad, but they also experienced momentary power loss. So based on that one experience, they all, I think, aviation authorities said, if there's this kind of dust cloud, don't fly through it. But it appears that volcanic ash over Java is different from volcanic ash out of this glacier in Iceland, because the volcanic ash out of Java is apparently very gritty. So it really pits the turbine blades, whereas the ash from Iceland is very fine, so it's like talcum powder, baby's breath, it seems to have had no effect. So they let it fly through. So experimentation proved to be a better indicator for action than reliance on models. So exploration and experimentations are often more valuable than predictions of analytical models. So we must be prepared to try things out. We must be prepared to experiment. And we do things in a safe-fail, not a fail-safe mode. Fail-safe mode means no error, but then nothing will happen, nothing will progress. If we had taken a fail-safe approach, the aircraft would have been grounded for weeks more. This is what I said in 2008, when I was still in service. Rather than plan exhaustively for every contingency before we move, we should adopt a search and discover approach, to act before the window closes and to act boldly in areas where we sense opportunities. We must be prepared to experiment, even if we cannot be entirely certain of the outcome. This approach is to probe, sense patterns, and to act, even in the absence of complete information. As I've emphasized before, we must learn to operate not in a fail-safe mode, but instead to operate in a safe-fail mode. So this is the solution to Clayton Christensen's dilemma. His solution to the innovator's dilemma is to create small self-contained units within the larger organization that have the mandate to experiment with new ideas and new concepts. Mainstream firms establish a timely position in disruptive technologies only when the firm's managers set up an autonomous organization charged with building a new and independent business around that disruptive technology. If the units succeed, then their formula can be proliferated. If they fail, then the organizational impact will be limited. It's ring-fenced. And I did this in the Ministry of Defense. This was because I was quite worried about how we keep on improving the Ministry of Defense. the Singapore Armed Forces. So I set up a Future Systems Directorate. Its job is to try new ideas out, completely new ideas out. And the person I chose to head this was, we called him the Future Systems Architect. His job is to think about the future. I gave him 1% of the defense budget to experiment, 1%. And I told him you have only one KPI, key performance indicator. Your KPI is, if I don't get any complaints about you, you're not doing your job. I constructed this family tree of failure, good failure and bad failure. You must learn from failure. Good failure is the love child of experimentation and discovery. It's the mother of success. A mother because paternity is a matter of opinion, but maternity is a matter of fact. Of course, bad failure is a bastard spawn of ignorance and hubris, and it's a runt of success that's only acknowledged in whispers. Never mind. Managing risk in complex environments, big decisions have to be made. Even if you don't make a decision, you're making a decision. So you have to make decisions in conditions of incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. And in Singapore, because of this, we recently developed something called a whole of government integrated risk management system. And we are identifying risk at the strategic level. And we use this to mobilize resources, to bring behavioral change to address these risks, and to explore connections among risk factors. And you'll be surprised. When you start doing this, at least the techniques we have used, you actually can start uncovering some of the connections which were previously hidden. Now, this fellow, Bayam, the most basic issue for organizational success is correctly matching the system's complexities to its environment. What does this mean? I mentioned to you the Jamaah Islamiyah. The Jamaah Islamiyah was a complex organization, and it still is a complex organization. It's self-organizing. It's got all these cells all over the place. They are only held together by certain common beliefs. It's a complex organization. Can you kill off a complex organization by just setting up one task force to do it? The answer is no. So we took a whole of government approach. Many agencies, including agencies outside government, to deal with different aspects of the problem. And this is what it is. The whole of government approach to deal with a complex network. That is a complex approach to deal with a complex problem. That's what it's all about. Now, however, this is a big however. I've served for more than 30 years in government. I've studied organizations, and unfortunately, we are dealing with human beings. So, in theory, you can talk about whole of government, you can talk about whole of nation. But what is the biggest barrier? The biggest barrier are the silos. Bureaucracies are basically silos. Governments will optimize at the departmental level rather than the whole of government level. And yet, the key in dealing with complexity is to be able to share information not vertically, but horizontally. And when you can do this, then you are more likely to discover the hidden connections, the emergent challenges and opportunities. But you have to break down the silos. And this whole of government approach is better for dealing with wicked problems. There's no point saying I've got a climate change problem and then set up a climate change department or Ministry of Climate Change and then expect it can deal with the problem, because there are many aspects to the problem that are outside the competence of the Ministry of Climate Change. So we must think of how we can deal with things. So when we have more wicked problems, you need to have a whole of government approach. But to get the whole of government approach, there must be a big change of mindset, breaking down the vertical silos. And this is the big obstacle to whole of government. This is your turf. You don't disturb my turf, whole of government. So whole of government is David against the Goliath of my turf. And everywhere, Singapore, US, Iceland, it's all the same. So you must nag. Keep on telling people, break down the silos all the time. Nagging is an inherent skill of leadership. So I think in Singapore, maybe we are moving towards a kind of third-generation leadership. There'll be many highways and byways along the way, but this means from govern to you and govern for you, we are going to move to govern with you. That means we work together, whole of nation, whole of government. It's not governed by agency, which is a silo. It's not even whole of government. It's a whole of nation coming together. So we talk a bit about resilience. How do you cope with strategic shocks? You must be resilient. But, you know, governments like to talk about lean and efficient organizations. But if you're lean and efficient, how do you have the extra capacity you need when a shock comes? And it's becoming more of an issue because, if I'm right, there'll be more and more shocks. And if you are too lean and too efficient, you don't have the extra capacity to deal with these shocks. So you must have a resilient system, that hump. Of course, it can also be a horse designed by a committee, but you know, that's a resilient system. It's amazingly resilient. You read the history of the camel. It thrives in Australia. It's not even native to Australia. So one of our, this is just a small advertisement. I'm senior advisor to the Center of Strategic Futures. It's one of our efforts to inject some resilience into the system. It's that extra capacity to think about the future that we are injecting into the Singapore government, Center for Strategic Futures. So the key questions of good governance: how can we prepare for a future in which we'll be surprised time and again? And this includes building deep capacities for strategic planning, employing forward-looking approaches and processes. You must be ready to challenge dominant narratives and paradigms, and we must be able to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. And we must have the resources to deal with unexpected shocks and work together collaboratively and innovatively across departments. That's the whole of government, whole of nation approach. So the first lesson, recognize we are working in an unordered, complex environment. Human cognition has its limitations, and we must expect to be surprised. So this is a final crude look at the whole. Recognize complexity, you must have tools, and the whole of government approach. And I'd like to just finish off with this quote from Winston Churchill, saying, you know, what's the quality of a good top official? And he said it's the ability to foretell what is going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, and to have the ability afterwards to explain why it didn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Am I glad that I asked you to to talk?
Oh, I see.
Are there? I'm sure there must be remarks, questions, and comments. And go ahead.
Why is it that we did not want to mention that? Because Singapore tried public entrepreneurship and then decided to discontinue. The other things that you mentioned about stop at 2, we have stop at 3, stop at 4, and many things. The question is that the government in the past were doing a lot of stops, and where the problems arises thereafter. The question is that backward thinking or forward thinking? The foresight problem.
Yeah, it's a. You know, first, let me attempt to answer your first question by simply saying this was meant to be a crude look. It's not meant to be a comprehensive look. I tried to look at the key issues which I thought were relevant to the issue at discussion. But on your second point, I think governments do try to look forward. They do try to look forward. Where the failure comes, if there is a failure, is a failure to recognize that no matter what policy you implement, it's got a use-by date, you know, because of complexity. So in other words, a policy that may work for, say, a couple of years may because of complexity and the consequences of complexity, start to become dysfunctional. So in the case of our population policy, it became clear that it was a dysfunctional policy after about, I think about 5 years, it became clear that it was a dysfunctional policy. But then, at least you have to give the government credit for acknowledging that it was a dysfunctional policy. And then when they tried to change it, they failed. I showed in the slide, they tried everything. Incentives, disincentives, all kinds of things, and they're still failing. Now they've got a new big package, supposed to be very generous. I don't know whether it'll have any impact, because all the evidence of other countries which have this kind of TFR is they will not succeed. They've not succeeded. Yeah, and there's one thing which I think we might not be able to do, but I won't debate it here. He said France is, we generally discourage families from having children out of wedlock. But maybe if you can, maybe that will change things. But it's... Yes, Carrie?
The difference was, and your metaphor probably wasn't quite the right one to use for your point. The case in Java case was there was enough ash that it actually melted on the turbines and shut the engines down. In the case of that test flight, it was already dilute enough that it didn't. The basic problem here is actually it's complicated, and no manufacturer of engines wants to know what level of concentration of ash will shut their engines down. Singapore Airlines included does not want to know what those levels are. They don't want to do a test. So actually here's a case where just simple knowledge and basic experimentation ahead of time would actually have helped them decide when to appropriately shut down or open up the airspace again. But because no one has yet allowed the experiment to be done, nobody knew when to open up the airspace again. So the activity you explained was the right thing to do an experiment.
It should have been done before.
The experiment should be done on the ground with engines, with throwing sand into an engine and seeing when it melts and shuts down. So there's a case where science can do some good ahead of time if you guys would let us.
But I think this is partly ignorance. This is a cognitive bias. Why do I invest in something the answers may not be entirely pleasant, because if you do the experiment itself may be cheap, but the medicine you have to take may be extremely expensive and nobody wants to know. So let's pretend it's not a problem. Okay, good. Sorry, Guaning and then Bob.
Two questions, Peter. We've been colleagues for a long time, and I really admire your intellect, and I think that was demonstrated in the talk. I don't know whether this is something you're in a position to comment, but our population white paper has created a lot of uproar or discussion in the population. I'm not sure whether there was a lack of sufficiently good modeling of the system, whether there was too much linear extrapolation as opposed to looking at it as a complex system. I'd like your comment on that. And secondly, we've been talking about overturning the conventional economics, and I think Brian Arthur is right here. He's the advocate of that. And I wonder whether that would have helped in the formulation of the white paper, in the sense of the economic growth model and how economic incentives can work. I will be very keen to hear your comments on that.
I'll respond to that, not in great detail, because I think some of this is not familiar to the non-Singaporean participants. But the population white paper is white papers, as you know, in the parliamentary tradition, the Westminster parliamentary tradition, are supposed to reflect government policy. You table it, it's debated, but it's government policy. So this was what happened. It was a government position on projection of how population was expected to grow. So from the current 5.3 is projected to grow to 6.9 by the year 2030. And they created an uproar because there's a question of do we have the space for this kind of population? But of course, there are a lot of unanswered questions in this policy, which I think is a result of perhaps not very good communications and explanation behind the white paper, because even if you hit 6.9 by 2030, which is quite a lot, what happens after 2030? Nobody has answered this question. And then there's one particular assumption which I think reflects perhaps too simplistic a view of the situation, and that is there's only one economic model. Because it's that economic model that forms the basis to drive the forecast of the population. Is productivity in the conventional sense the only way to go for Singapore, which means you must have more warm bodies, and if you can't get it through through the citizen population growth, then you have to get it through bringing in foreign population. And so I think this was not adequately discussed, nor was it adequately explained. You know, we talk a lot about the knowledge economy. Which way is the economy going? How much of it will be a manufacturing economy in 20, 30 years' time? How much of it will be knowledge economy? How much of it will be a service economy? I don't think that was given sufficient airing. So I think at a simplistic level, it was not well communicated. At a sophisticated intellectual level, I think also not very well presented. So I think it caused a lot of confusion, and I think caused, unfortunately, the government to backtrack on what should have been just a straightforward policy position. My 2 cents worth. Sorry, I've got Bob, and I don't know who else. Yeah.
This is probably a delicate question, but I want to ask you about experimentation at the national level. So most democracies believe that there are two institutions that dramatically help in the long run. One is the circulation of elites through elections and competing political parties, and the other is a press that is independent and able to criticize the government. From what a little I know about Singapore, there's neither one of those. And so do you think that there is a need for a major change in the form of government and the press, or in order to keep the extremely successful record of the top-down management?
You know, I take a slightly different, I'll respond in a slightly different way. I think what has happened is these changes are going to happen, but it's changed because it's kind of forced on the government. What should have happened is some of this should have been anticipated earlier, and the changes ought to have been made, so you're not put in this kind of position. But again, this goes back to your Christensen's dilemma. You have been very successful. Look, this is one party that's been in power since 1957. It's got an impeccable track record in terms of delivering the goods. So why do they want to change the formula, even though there are many who say, you know, this is not going to work, this is a new generation, different expectations, the social media is having an impact. All these were said. A lot of the things, as I told you in the scenarios which we did, early scenarios, Hotel Singapore and House Divided, were foreseen. But the incentive to change is not sufficient to overcome the inertia. So I think this is a problem. That's why I say if you are trying to influence decision makers to make big cost changes, you either have to have a bit more patience, and sometimes you don't have that luxury of time. So I would say, yes, some of these things could have been done earlier, but the fact that they didn't is a reflection more of some of these cognitive problems we have to deal with. So now they are changing, but they're changing in response. When you change ahead of the need to change, then you're in control of things. So that would be my response to your question.
One media.
I think you better organize this thing because I'm not keeping track of who is putting up their hands.
I think you were first, right?
Yeah.
No, you're first. Yeah.
My question is, I completely agree with you, and thanks for a very enlightening speech. The experimentation that you said, the best way to learn is to go in there and spread the failure. But sometimes for resource crunch countries, this experimentation becomes difficult. Do you have anything alternative in mind? Means maybe, if you are rich already, you can experiment with resource to learn. But if you're in a resource crunch situation like, say, India and China, this kind of experimental failures might create backlash.
No, it's true. I'm not trying to paper over the problems, but don't forget that in Singapore, in the early years, I think we were in a completely experimental mode. And we had no resources. You could say there was a resource crunch, there was no money. Yet the government decided they were prepared to try things out. And if they fail, they fail, they succeed. And most of them, because they were clever people, were successful up to a point. The industrialization program, the housing program, education, everything. These were experiments. These were bold experiments with no guarantee because they were going against conventional wisdom. So these were all experiments. And like the population thing, when you realize it's a mistake, well, you either fine-tune or tweak, or like population, you try to reverse, but unfortunately you can't reverse it, so the damage is done, can't be helped. But, so, yes, you're right, there are problems, but it's a question of what you want. You are a government, you are in charge. What are you prepared to do? If you say you lay the blame on lack of resource crunch or the bad reaction, then you just tweak here, tweak there. You won't bring any quantum improvement. You must be prepared to take the risk, but many governments are not prepared to take that risk. So if they're not prepared to take a risk, well, the consequences of that follow.
Thank you.
Where's the next
you
question?
Point, huh? You better point.
The lady over there.
Hello, I'm Kaishi from NTU. Could you share with us some of the key predictions for Singapore's future in maybe like 20 to 30 years? Like, it's okay if the predictions are wrong because you can always explain that. Like, just.
As I pointed out to you, I hate to try to duck this question, but we are not in the business of making predictions. I wouldn't even dare, maybe I would have said I won't be alive, but nowadays with the medicine and the healthcare, I might still be alive in 30 years from now. So that's the only prediction I was about to say, but then, you see, the whole business is not about what the world is going to be. If you take a straight line projection, you'll end up at certain endpoints. But what is going to happen is there are going to be game changers that will start to insert themselves at different points in time. It could be climate change. It could be a change of political leadership. Supposing suddenly PAP come 2021 is no longer in power. That's a big game changer. Then it brings you to a branching point in which you can then go into new trajectories. So all I'm saying is the processes which we use can help us understand the possibilities, but it's not about assigning probabilities that this or this is going to happen. We don't really know. Many of the things which I flashed, whether it's ethnic groups, they're just emerging strategic issues. It's suggesting to you that there's something we should be looking at, and perhaps we should understand the implications a bit better. For example, manufacturing. Supposing manufacturing is changed dramatically by all this 3D manufacturing, home manufacturing, bespoke manufacturing, all these kinds of things where people do things at home and then somebody somehow assembles it together somewhere else. What does it mean to your economy? Big changes, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. But you better understand, because if you are behind the curve, we will be in trouble.
Raymond Kwok, Peter. The program is complexities, and my understanding is that nowadays it's getting shorter and shorter. Everything is happening at one time. I'm here. Yeah. Now, the issue is that, do you think that by technologies and science and various other things, are we able to be ahead of the curve to do what you're talking about, scenario planning plus, to be able to go sufficient, ahead of the curve to understand and got a whole suite of deck cards that is able to say, okay, this is actually happening. Are we able to, react to this in this way?
Well, the first step is to have the tools. But having the tools doesn't mean that people will act based on what you produce. So the next step is to then get the decision makers who are making the decisions to say this is serious enough for us to act on. But that's, I think, almost a bigger challenge than thinking about the future. In fact, I think it is the single biggest challenge. And that is why we are beginning to look at things that help us deal with these cognitive biases like policy gaming and so on. That's a whole big subject.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hosa. I'm Kevin Koh from NTU, School of Chemical Engineering. So your 34 years of public service is really very illustrious, and as a Singaporean, I'm very appreciative of how you shaped our country. I would like to ask you a question with your wearing your hat as now the chairman of the Urban Renewal Authority. In the past 3 days, actually, our very illustrious guest speakers here have highlighted the impact of climate change on life on Earth. And in Singapore, I'm sure many of the visitors here, as well as lecturers here, are also very sensitive about this in our very small country. Just about a week ago, a past president of the Architect Association of Singapore, after quite a bit of calculations and studies, came up with a proposal in a conference. I think you may recall it was reported in the papers, giving a vision of maybe having a New York in the south and a Bali in the north of Singapore to help preserve our greenery, the little greenery that we have, but also to house our growing population. He came up with a plan to house about 2 million more people, actually, in a nice urbanized southern belt. Of course, relocating our harbors and all, our ports and all. I'm just wondering if you could comment on this vision and whether URA sees this as quite a way to go to strike a balance.
Well, you see, I know which proposal you're talking about. This is Tay Keng Soon's proposal, and his proposal is to concentrate all the population in a very small enclave to the south of Singapore, where the city currently is. So this will become a bit like
Manhattan.
Not Manhattan. This will become like this island country. Is it Maldives? Anyway, whatever it is, yeah, these are options, but you don't forget that kind of density carries a certain social cost if you want to live in that kind of very dense. As it is, we are already one of the densest, densely populated countries. So all I'm saying is the URA, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, will look at all these options. But in the end, there are very complex trade-offs you have to make. You want some space for your people, and they want the greenery, they're used to the greenery outside their homes. So if you change their mindset and they're prepared to accept, just looking across to their neighbor's window or their neighbor's kitchen, then okay, you can have that kind of thing. All I'm saying is you can look at all the options, but they're very complex trade-offs because this is a wicked problem. Urban planning in a place like Singapore is a wicked problem because we are running up against very hard limits to our size. You can reclaim a bit more land, assuming we can find the sand, you can reclaim a bit more land, but sooner or later you're going to run into deep waters or our territorial boundaries. So how much more you can grow? And you start doing that, you have to give up your port. And then you need space for industry, you need space for recreation. So all these require trade-offs. I'm not saying Keng Soon's proposal is off the table. I'm saying it's only one of many options which are available. And the URA's job is to look at the different options and decide or to make a recommendation which course of action to choose.
And just to clarify, sir, the idea was to house an extra 2 million.
No, I know.
To shift the rest of the population southwards.
Just to house an extra 2 million carry consequences. That's your city center, There's your businesses, your financial centers, all there. You start to crowd that out. You have to kick out. There won't be your nice Marina Bay. You have to give up office space. So you have to make trade-offs.
Sir, it was with Marina Bay.
No, I think we shouldn't debate this too long. I'm just telling you that trade-offs. You have to decide what those trade-offs are.
Okay, thank you.
The gentleman on the other side of the aisle.
Peter, thank you for your talk. Since yours is the last talk, and I could be mistaken, but with your permission and perhaps with the permission of the chairman, can I ask a question which is not directly related to Peter?
Can you speak in the microphone? Because I don't hear you.
Peter, thank you for your, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for your talk. Now, since yours happens to be the last presentation, with your permission and with permission of chairman, if I may ask a question which perhaps covers a bit broader ground than Peter's specific talk. Of course, I very much would appreciate Peter's comment as well. So far, I missed a few talks, so I don't really know, maybe I missed some talks that were on this particular subject. I believe that so far I have not, it's not obvious to me that anybody has commented on this one thing. A lot of talk about the effect of human activities, about global warming, about all these topics, but when we look at these things, right, isn't it true that a lot of these activities are driven by economic considerations? And currently, when you look at economics, which is the indicator that is widely followed, that has got a lot of weightage? Is it not the GDP, the gross domestic product? Now, if we follow this indicator, then there will be consequences to it. In some of the talks, I think there was mentioned briefly of the happiness index, etc. But you feel that perhaps we need to look at an alternative indicator, because if you keep following one indicator, it has got its consequences. And if we see so many consequences, like in the GDP, there's double counting going on, if I understand it correctly, that as you up your productivity, there are negative consequences, but you don't count those. You don't take those as negative. So your GDP goes up. And when you start to clean up again you credit to your GDP. So both ways now the GDP goes up. So clearly this is not favorable. So can we have some comments on this? I heard about alternative indicators like it's called the GPI, but there are complications, etc. May I have your comments?
I'm not sure whether first competent, and I'm not sure whether I should expand the discussion beyond the scope of this conference, but just a very short comment on GDP. GDP clearly is a very important indicator, but as you correctly point out, it doesn't necessarily describe the whole. It describes one aspect, and searches for alternatives that can describe the whole are also incomplete. Your gross national happiness, which Bhutan pioneered, yes, but in a very developed state, the kind of indicators they use don't necessarily mean that just because you have low GDP, low GNH, you're necessarily unhappy. I still remember that after a few years at the top of the ranking, Bhutan got displaced by Kiribati. Kiribati is one of these South Pacific islands, and its only claim to fame is I think they invented some form of bungee jumping. These are the people who jump off these rattan towers, and if you are unlucky, you break your neck. People die jumping off from these things. So yeah, there's a search, but I don't think there's any agreement about how you define in a holistic way the well-being of a state. There are many things, and I would say even what is well-being today may change in 20 years' time because of changing expectations, changing technologies, and all that sort of thing. But I don't think we should really expand this discussion to this area.
I realize that there's a great chance to interrogate Peter on anything that you want to, but I think you have to find a special time for that, and we won't do it now. Unless there's questions really relevant to the talk, then you have one? Okay.
And there's somebody there.
Yeah. Peter, thanks very much for your talk. I run a little think tank in London, and coincidentally, my co-director is Paul Ormerod, who you quoted.
Paul Ormerod.
Paul, yeah, he's my co-director at Synthesis. I've spent a few years thinking about sort of government policy and complexity, and I've pretty much drawn the same conclusions you have. So it's a kind of relief to see your presentation. But the question I have is about the sort of receptivity, I guess, if that's a word, of complexity sort of by East and West. Okay, one of our esteemed colleagues yesterday kind of talked about the different sort of frameworks of reference and thinking in our heads between Chinese and the West. And my experience in general is that if you speak to a Westerner, especially a politician, and you talk about complexity, they think I'm stupid because they just don't agree with me. Okay, whereas if I speak to someone who's Chinese, they think I'm stupid because it's bloody obvious. Okay, so my question to you, that's a massive overgeneralization, but my question to you is, do you think the sort of the Chinese mindset, which we heard yesterday, is more conducive to understanding complexity theory?
Well, I think, first I make a general comment. I think the human being, the minds, the brains are all wired up in the same way. But if you look at a particular study done by Richard Nisbet, and if you read a book called Geography of Thought, he has studied the cultural differences between people with, say, a Western liberal type of background and those who come from Confucian, Asian background, particularly the Japanese and the Chinese. And there are big differences in which they look at things. And I explained to you the differences. Sorry, no, I was not here, so okay. So I think what it means is that although they've got the same set of cognitive biases, I think your chances of getting an Asian to look at the whole rather than look at the part is higher than with, and you know the difference. If you look at a picture and the picture has a horse, the Westerner will remember the horse, but he will not remember the background. whereas the Asian is more likely to not just remember the horse, but he's going to remember the color of the sky, whether the grass was overgrown or whether it was properly cropped. So that's ability to look at the whole picture rather than the narrow, rather than just what stands out.
Yes. Okay. Hi. My name's Alec. I'm from the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities. I like what. Put it on. Hello? Is it better? Okay, hi. My name's Alec. I'm from the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities. I like what you said about breaking the silos, and I wonder if you can describe for us what a 21st century city would look like that is successfully, its organizational structure that has successfully broken the silos.
Well, I don't know whether there's a real model for this, but I can tell you a real example of the trend, at least in the Singapore government. You know, in the Singapore government, we're a traditional model of a government. You know, we have got Ministry of Health, we've got Ministry of Education, Ministry of Defense, and so on. That's a traditional hierarchical model of government. And we inherited that model from the British. And in normal times, it makes a lot of sense. But then again, because of complexity, the demands and the challenges change over time. So, for example, imagine when you are confronted with a problem like the Jamaah Islamiyah in 2001, it's the first important judgment that was made was this is going to be a problem that's going to stay with us not for a few years but for maybe generations. And it's not going to be a existential problem, but it's going to be a problem which we have to deal with. Now, we had two alternatives. One alternative was to do what was done in the United States, and that was to create a Department of Homeland Security which meshed together something like 24, 25 departments pulled out from all over the place. You know, they took out Customs, they took out Coast Guard, they rammed them together and say, now we've got a department to deal with this problem. The irony is Ashton Carter, who's now the Deputy Secretary for Defense, wrote a very interesting piece which influenced us. Said it's the piece called Architecture of Government in the Era of Transnational Terrorism. That was the piece. And he argued completely against the approach of creating a Department of Homeland Security. He said each of these departments has an existing function, which is not unimportant. So if you customs, what's the function of customs? It's revenue collection. What's the function of the Coast Guard? It's safety at sea. But if you put them under this Department of Homeland Security, then they will lose their focus on these duties which are not unimportant and start focusing on keeping the beast at bay. So his recommendation was a different one. Go for matrix organization. And in fact, I think Singapore went that way, and almost every country I know went that way, created a kind of matrix organization. That means you draw on the strengths of different departments or ministries, and you just have a small coordinating center to coordinate the thing. And in Singapore, we did that by setting up the National Security Coordination Secretariat, and you give it its power by putting it under the Prime Minister. So if people don't follow, you just crack the whip. The Prime Minister wishes it to be done, and that's everything is done. So that's the way. And I think increasingly, because complexity is going to introduce more and more of these kinds of big problems, you can't be setting up more and more departments to deal with. In the end, you'll have 100 departments. What's the point of it? You'll become dysfunctional, completely dysfunctional. So you must find instead more of these coordinating mechanisms. But these coordinating mechanisms require an ability of the main ministries, the main departments, to also commit to doing work that is not outside their main statutory duties. That's whole of government. But that requires a whole new change of mindset.
Okay, I'll have one last question, Peter Sloat.
Peter, many thanks for your talk. I have one question. You were saying, we shouldn't wait for the future to happen. We should act and try to kind of change it. Now, one of the things that we see happening time and again in all these complex problems is the role that the media play. Like, for the Arabs, not spring, the Arab winter, and the Euro crisis. But even for pandemics, we know that the role of the media is large. So the media, to some extent, is kind of a weapon of mass destruction. Can we turn the media into a weapon of mass peace?
My own guess is that we are moving through a particular phase in which the mass, or more precisely the social media, has begun to exert an influence which even the traditional broadsheets and tabloids were not able to do. And if you look at Singapore today, the mainstream media is falling. That means the newspapers, they're losing their readership. But the viewership in the news and all that is all going, the television news is all going up. So these are, I think, beginning to change. And my own guess is this will organize itself. In which way, I have no idea. Governments don't know how to deal with new social media. Which Facebook posting do you respond to and which do you ignore? It's a big problem. And then, furthermore, it's not as if the social media is of one voice. In fact, it's worse. It's highly fragmented. And, there may be groups which agree on one issue and they splinter to disagree on another issue. So I think this is becoming a real challenge. And I suspect it's going to lead to, this is why complexity is going to be an integral part of government's ability to deal with more fragmented, because more fragmented means you're accentuating the role of individual agents within the complex system, and how do you deal with it. Maybe the best way to deal with it is to just let them alone and get on with your business. I don't know, but I think it's not going to be easy to use the traditional model of you regulate and things will happen. It may not happen that way. So that's a long way of saying I really don't know where this is all going to go.
Okay. I think we'll conclude the interrogation with Peter right now. Thank you very much. A little surprise. You'll find out what is in it.